Hi, my name is Schyler Church. I am a California real estate broker as well as a member of the education department at Accredited Real Estate Schools. We provide the course requirements as well as varying levels of preparation to be eligible to take the state exam and also be prepared to pass it. And that's what we're talking about today is reviewing for that state exam and some practice questions to help you do so. So let's dive on in. 1. The following is real property. A harvested crop of wheat. B, a bearing wall in a single-family dwelling. C, a built-in refrigerator in a mobile home which is not attached to a foundation. D, a trade fixture attached in such a way that can be removed without damage. Okay, so just from reading this, we think that you should automatically assume that there is one best answer just by knowing the material. But let's break down each of the answer options to make sure we understand them and you don't just automatically assume. So we're looking for what is considered real property. A, we have a harvested crop of wheat. Well, we know if a crop of wheat is attached to the root system, it's real property. But when it becomes harvested, it's severed and then it becomes movable, and that is then personal property. So A is not correct. B, a bearing wall in a single-family dwelling. Well, we know single-family dwelling is real property, and the bearing wall inside that single-family dwelling is also real property because, remember, that is the main wall that keeps the house up, for instance. And so that would be real property. So that looks to be the best answer. C, a built-in refrigerator. Okay, that sounds like it could be real property. Oh, but in a mobile home which is not attached to a foundation. So because the mobile home that's not attached to a foundation is personal property, well, then the built-in refrigerator would also be considered personal property with that mobile home. A trade fixture attached in such a way that can be removed without damage. Well, when you see the word or term trade fixture, you should think of an item that is used in the course of business by a tenant leasing a space. And so it could be attached to the wall, and in this case it is, and it can be removed without damage. That really doesn't matter too much in regards to trade fixture, because trade fixture is usually personal property, and especially in this case. So the best answer is B, a bearing wall in a single-family dwelling. And here's an example of it. So here is an exterior look of it. We have a load-bearing wall right here. We have a ceiling joist. So remember, joists can be in the ceiling or in the floor. And then we have the slab, concrete slab, as well as the footings. So this is a really great depiction of important terms you should know for the state exam. And then question number 2. Fee simple estate refers to A, the greatest interest a person can own in land. B, an easy way to transfer title. C, a common way to hold title. D, an expensive way to transfer title. Well, when we think of fee simple estates, we should be automatically assuming under freehold estates that fee simple can be classified under absolute or defeasible. But fee simple itself is the greatest interest a person can own in land. So that looks to be the best answer. Fee simple estates really have nothing to do with transferring title. We usually use deeds to transfer title. A common way to hold title. No, fee simple estate doesn't actually refer to vesting. For instance, vesting deals with if it's held in severalty, community property, joint tenancy, tenancy in common, etc. An expensive way to transfer title. We don't really care about transferring title and how much it costs. Thus, the best answer is A. The greatest interest a person can own in land. That refers to fee simple estate. And I want to go over a little bit of a diagram regarding this because fee simple estates fall under freehold estates. And what's the difference between a freehold and a leasehold estate? Well, both forms are estates in land, but freehold estates, those are gives you the highest form of ownership, and it's considered real property. Whereas if you have a leasehold estate, it's just a possessory interest and personal property. So let's break down freehold versus leasehold estates. So we talked about fee simple already, and fee simple falls under a freehold estate. And there are 2 types, fee simple absolute and fee simple defeasible. So fee simple absolute is the highest form of ownership. The owner has the entire bundle of ownership rights without any restrictions. So this is the best form of ownership, fee simple absolute. Fee simple does have the greatest interest someone can own in land, but fee simple absolute is the absolute best. Messy, absolute there. But fee simple defeasible is also a great type of ownership, but there is a downside to it because title to the property can be defeated. So you do have the bundle of ownership rights, but you do have restrictions. So the title to the property can be defeated if you breach those restrictions. So that's important to know about. And then we have something called a life estate. And under life estate, there are two different types. We have an estate in reversion and an estate in remainder. So this basically allows you to enjoy a property for either your life or the life of someone else. For example, let's say Aunt Alice gives cousin Charlie the property. A property, and she says it's going to be for the length of your life, Charlie. Now, if Charlie passes away, then the estate will either revert back to Aunt Alice, just depending on how Aunt Alice specified it. But let's say Aunt Alice isn't around anymore. Well, then she may have an estate in remainder where it'll actually go to a remainder person. So if it reverts back to the original person, so for instance, Aunt Alice, it's an estate in reversion. But if it goes to a remainder person, it's estate in remainder. Now, then we have leasehold estates. So we have different types underneath it. And these are the ones you need to know for the state exam. So we have estate for years. Remember, this is one that starts and ends. It doesn't need to be for years. It could be for days, months, weeks. It could be for years, but it starts and it ends. And then we have estate from period to period, which we also call a periodic tenancy. This is one that's, it's an estate, it's basically where it starts and it ends and then it renews. So it just keeps renewing. An estate at will, this is when it's actually an estate for years, but it converts over to a periodic tenancy. So then it just keeps renewing after the estate for years is over. This is where the landlord and the tenant have both decided at will to remain in the property and continue with the terms. Whereas estate at sufferance is, well, let's say the tenant remains in the property and doesn't pay rent. So it's then going to be a sufferance. Well, the landlord is then suffering. So this is just a brief overview of it. So let's go over question number 3. If a buyer takes the property subject to the existing loan, subject to most nearly means A, both the buyer and seller will be liable on the loan. B, only the buyer will be liable for the loan. C, the seller has no liability for the loan. D, the buyer will not be personally liable for the loan. So you should be going over and thinking of the differences between subject to versus an assumption. Remember, subject tos you probably won't see in the real world, but because this is a little bit of a weird concept, you might see it on the state test. And subject to means that the buyer does assume the loan, the existing loan that, for instance, the seller had, but he's assuming it subject to. So he's actually not liable for the first 5 years. The seller remains liable. So out of these answer options, the best answer option would be D. The buyer will not be personally liable for the loan. And let's go through this a little bit. So remember, an assumption is where the seller assigns all the rights, obligations, and responsibilities of the loan to the buyer. The seller is then relieved of all responsibilities for repayment of the loan. The buyer is basically stepping into the seller's shoes. Whereas if it's a subject to, the lender does not approve of the assumption, so the seller will remain primarily liable for repayment of the loan for 5 years after the subject to assumption date. So the seller stays liable for the 5 years, and the buyer is not liable because the lender is not approving of this assumption. So this is a subject to. Now, these were happened a lot in the 80s, especially with FHA loans. They don't really happen anymore because lenders have something called a due on sale clause, but you do need to know about it for state exam purposes, the differences between assumption versus subject to. Question number 4, a deed. A, must be recorded to be delivered. B, does not have to be recorded to transfer title. C, must be delivered to be recorded. D, must be recorded if it will be used to transfer personal property. Okay, so talking about deeds, what this question's looking for is, does the deed need to be recorded? Does it need to be delivered? What do we know about this? So a trick is to look at the answer, the question, and try to kind of formulate your answer option prior to reading through the answers or dissecting them. So that way you have an idea of what you're looking for. So when we know about a deed, it does not need to be recorded to be valid. A deed, though, must be delivered. So the best answer out of all of these answer options is B. Does not have to be recorded to transfer title. If it is recorded, though, that does presume delivery. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. A deed has no effect unless it is delivered. The delivery must evidence the intention of the grantor, so the seller, to pass title immediately to the grantee, the buyer. Delivery of the deed is presumed when it is recorded. And remember, the most important deeds for the California state exam are grant deeds and quitclaim deeds. So you'll want to make sure to review those. But this is just general information regarding any type of deed. 5. The broker, as agent of the seller, owes the buyer A. Only a duty to disclose any item which relates directly to the sales price of the property. B. The same fiduciary obligations he owes to the seller. C. Only the duty to answer questions honestly. D. The duty of honest and fair dealing. So what we're talking about here is the broker, as agent of the seller, owes the buyer. Well, you should be looking at the agency relationship diagram. Well, the agent of the seller has a fiduciary duty to the seller, but he is not the agent of the buyer. And in that case, remember, the agent would then owe a duty of honest and fair dealing to all third parties in the transaction. So the broker of the seller, or the agent of the seller, would owe a duty of honest and fair dealing to the buyer. He does not have a fiduciary duty to the buyer. So remember, here's a little bit of a diagram overview. So what we're talking about is the agent of the seller. So the listing agent has a fiduciary duty to the seller. Remember, of utmost care, honesty, loyalty, integrity, all of those key words. But to third parties, so the buyer specifically, the listing agent has a duty of honest and fair dealing to the buyer. Whereas the selling agent, the agent of the buyer, has a fiduciary duty to the buyer, but a duty of honest and fair dealing to the seller. The first question we have, when an appraiser begins to determine the value of a residential property, he will consider the A, gross rent multiplier, B, square feet of living space, C, utility, D, marketability and acceptability. Well, let's dissect the question. So we're looking at what an appraiser is going to first be determining or first be looking at and considering when figuring out the value of a residential property. Well, we know that he's probably going to be looking at square feet of living space and utility, because remember, utility is one of the elements of value. And if it was an income property, he might also be looking at the gross rent multiplier. But the first thing he will be looking at is marketability and acceptability. Will people like it and will they buy it? That's the first thing he's going to be looking at. If marketability and acceptability wasn't an answer option to select from, though, the other option would be highest and best use. And then if neither of those ones were there, utility would be the other best answer. Because remember, the DRE usually has always two correct answers. But one is the better answer. And in the case of this question, the best answer is marketability and acceptability. And now what does this exactly mean? So we know it just says, will people like it and will they buy it? Well, marketability, the ability to sell or market a parcel of real property, and the acceptability, that's what we measure of how acceptable the property will be to the general buying public. So can we market it to people that will want to buy it? And then will they find it acceptable of the condition that it's in? So, and where it's at, and a lot of other factors. So marketability and acceptability. Question number 2. The liquidation of a financial obligation on an installment plan or basis is called A, conversion, B, amortization, C, acceleration, D, conveyance. Well, as always, let's dissect the question. So we're talking about a liquidation of a financial obligation on an installment plan or installment basis. Well, a financial obligation, let's say like a loan, and the liquidation of it, so you're paying off the loan on a constant, like an installment plan. Well, when we're doing so, that is not called conversion. It is called amortization. We know it's not acceleration or conveyance. So the best answer is amortization. And remember the amortization curve we have. So we have principal and interest payments here. So this is how much you're going to be paying, for instance, on a monthly basis right here. And then the time. So maybe your first month, second month, all the way up to, for instance, 360 months that you'll be paying this for. And this shows how much is going to be going towards principal and how much towards interest. So when you're first starting to pay off and pay off the financial obligation, well, you're going to be paying a little bit of principal and mostly interest. But by the time you pay it all off, so at this 30-year mark, for instance, your last payment will be mostly all principal and just a little bit of interest. 3. The developer is converting 5 apartments to a form of common ownership. This results in the separate ownership of the individual units and shared ownership of the common areas. This is so number A, timeshare. B, subdivision, so condominium project. C, community apartment project. D, all of the above are correct. Okay, so we're looking at 5 apartments that are going to be converted to a common type of ownership, so like a planned unit development, and each of those apartments is now going to have separate ownership. Instead of having one owner for all 5, it's going to be separate owners for each of them. Well, on that case, we know if it's 5 units or more, that is considered a subdivision. It's not a timeshare, so subdivision so far is the best answer, and it will be a condominium, so it's a condominium project. A community apartment project, no, it's not going to be an apartment anymore, it's a subdivision. So the best answer option is B, subdivision condominium project. And remember, let's go over the Subdivision Map Act and the Subdivided Lands Law. So the Subdivision Map Act is used to physically subdivide a property from one parcel to 2 or more parcels. So if for some reason you are going to have a parcel of land and you're subdividing it into at least 2 or more parcels, then the Subdivision Map Act would apply. Now, if you are going to be subdividing the property into 5 or more parcels, the Subdivided Lands Law will apply. And what this means is, so if you're subdividing a parcel of property into, let's say, 7 units, well, the Subdivided Lands Law will apply, but also the Subdivision Map Act will also apply. And there must be 5 or more lots to be called a subdivision. 4. Title insurance protects the A, seller, B, beneficiary, C, mortgagee, D, buyer. So who does title insurance ultimately protect? Well, it protects the buyer. So the buyer is the one that's ultimately protected from title insurance. Yes, the seller, it's great for when selling the property that the buyer gets title insurance to possibly limit future liability or litigation down the road, but it ultimately is going to protect the buyer when they purchase the property and title issues that could come about when they're owning the property or supposedly supposed to own it. So let's go through this. So remember, buyers should obtain title insurance, and it takes effect at close of escrow. Remember, though, no title insurance policy covers everything. And you do need to know the difference between CLTA versus ALTA. So remember, the California Land Title Association, which is the owner's standard coverage, or the extended coverage policy we have with ALTA, which is the American Land Title Association. And just remember the basics. So CLTA, that covers the owner against all recorded items in the chain of title to the property, forgery, incompetence, lack of capacity, and improper delivery of a recorded deed. Whereas ALTA, because it's the extended title insurance policy, this is mostly considered like the lender's policy, for instance. It covers everything that CLTA does cover, but it also includes physical survey, boundary lines, unrecorded encumbrances, and encroachments. And then 5. Abel owns an apartment building and undertakes a 1031 exchange. He may A, exchange his apartment building for one more valuable, exchange loans, and pay the balance in cash. B, purchase an apartment building of lesser value. C, purchase personal property as long as it is of lesser value. D, none of the above are correct. Well, okay, we're talking about an apartment building, so real estate, and he's going to be exchanging it with a 1031 exchange. What do we know about exchanges? So he's doing the delayed exchange, and real estate needs to be exchanged for real estate, so of like kind, and it has to be at value or higher. So let's see here. When we look at answer option A, exchange his apartment building for one more valuable, so exchanging an apartment building for one of like kind, exchange loans, and pay the balance in cash. So he's going to be buying something or exchanging into something more valuable, which he can do, and he'll just be making up the difference of that in cash. That definitely is something he could do. B, purchase an apartment building of lesser value. That is not okay. You cannot do that with a 1031 exchange. It has to be of equal or higher value. C, purchase personal property as long as it is of lesser value. Well, we know lesser value automatically is a no, but personal property he cannot do because that's not of like kind. D, none of the above are correct. That's not true because A is correct. So A is the best answer. Exchange his apartment building for one more valuable, exchange loans, and pay the balance in cash. And let's go over exchanges real quick. So remember, when an investor sells an income property and receives a capital gain, the investor has two options. They can cash out, so pay a tax on this capital gain received, or exchange the property for another equal or higher price property and follow strict rules. Because remember, this is regulated by the IRS. And there's two types of exchanges you can do. A straight across exchange where each investor exchanges properties directly to each other, which is definitely doable, but you're not going to be, this is very hard to do and it's not common. Whereas in a delayed exchange, which is what the IRS code of the 1031 exchange is, where the investor sells the property and reinvests the proceeds into another like-kind property within a prescribed time period. So this is the delayed exchange. And these exchanges allow postponement of capital gain taxes. So you're not being exempt from paying them, you're just deferring, postponing the payment of the capital gains taxes. The first question we have, priority of liens is generally established by the A, recording dates of the liens, B, dates of the liens, C, amounts of the liens, D, dates of the judgments. Okay, well, we know a judgment is a lien, but that doesn't mean that all liens are judgments. So we know D is not correct. C, the amounts of the liens, doesn't matter how much it is. That doesn't come to account for priority. Dates of the liens, yes, that's important when the dates were, but A, recording dates of the liens. Okay, so what is the usually establishes priority? So the dates of the lien does establish priority, but it's generally established based on the recording dates of the lien. Because remember, first to record is first in rights, except for three exceptions. And I'm going to give you a moment here to think about it. Remember, taxes, mechanics liens, and subordinated loans. Those are the three exceptions to the first to record is first in rights. 2, taking private land by government bodies for public use is generally governed by due process of law and is accomplished through A, a sheet, B, exercise of police power, C, reversion, D, eminent domain. Let's dissect the question again. Taking private land by government bodies for public use. Okay, so this should automatically be making you think of something where the government is taking private land and making it public use, and it's generally governed by due process of law. And how is it accomplished? Well, we know it's not accomplished through a sheet. That deals with if the property is, for instance, somebody passes away and there are no heirs, then the property will escheat to the state. That doesn't mean that the government is taking private land for public use. Exercise of police power. No, police power is used for zoning. Reversion, that doesn't have to do with this. But eminent domain, yes. Eminent domain is what is used to accomplish the government taking private land for public use. So eminent domain is the correct answer, but remember, the government must compensate the landowner for his loss, and it has to be fair market value for the compensation of this. And let's go to question number 3. A person who has been given the right to act on behalf of another is known as A, affidavit, B, attorney in fact, C, executor, D, principal. Okay, so a person who has been given the right to act on behalf of another is known as, well, we should be thinking of power of attorney here. And when we're thinking of power of attorney, who is that person that is given the right to act on behalf of another? Well, that is the attorney in fact. That's the best answer. But let's verify. Affidavit, though? Nope, not an affidavit. That doesn't give you the right to act on behalf of another. Executor? No, that deals with wills, for instance. Principal? That's the actual person that is signing for themselves. So the best answer is B, attorney in fact, which deals with power of attorney. 4. Terms and conditions of the sale of a specific parcel of real property would generally affect the A, utility of the subject property, B, value of the subject property, C, basis of the subject property, D, price of the subject property. Okay, well, terms and conditions of a sale, when in regards to a specific parcel of real property, what does it generally affect? Does it affect the utility, value, basis, or price? Well, it doesn't affect the utility of it, the terms and conditions of the sale. It doesn't really, the value, no, because the value is just what it is. Basis, no, we don't really care about the basis anyway in regards to this, but price. Well, what is actually somebody going to pay due to the terms and conditions? That could affect it, whereas it could say, hey, we might not pay as much if we're going to have to be paying for all the closing costs, for instance. So the terms and the conditions of the sale of a specific parcel of real property would generally affect the price of the subject property. So what the buyer is actually willing to pay based on the terms and conditions. Because the value will always remain the same, and utility too, regarding and the basis, that doesn't have anything to do with it in regards to the terms and conditions of the sale, but the price, that can change things, as well as if there are repairs being completed, for instance. So the price, what the buyer is actually going to pay. D is the correct answer. Price may be greater than value too. So remember that. Value is what we use an appraiser for to help us find the appropriate value, but the price that somebody actually pays may be greater than value because they maybe really want the property and it's all subjective. So they're going to pay more to get the property than maybe what somebody would pay what they believe the actual value is. 5. All of the following are essential elements of each and every contract except A, mutuality, B, offer and acceptance, C, consideration, D, writing. Well, let's see here. What are the essential elements of a valid contract? Okay, well, we know there has to be genuine offer and genuine acceptance. So mutuality has to be consent, basically mutual consent or mutual assent. And there also has to be consideration, so something of value, and the capacity to contract, of course. So those are the 4 required elements of each and every contract. But writing is not a requirement because that is not a requirement of a real estate contract, of a contract, but it is a requirement of any real estate contract except leases of a year or less, because of the statute of frauds. And that also affects other contracts. If it takes over a year to perform and to complete, then writing is required as well. But for the basics of a valid contract, writing is not a requirement. So writing is not an essential element unless it's a real estate contract. All real estate contracts except a year or less, then it's a requirement, but not of each and every contract. So they're just saying a general contract here. Remember, valid contract, the 4 essential elements of any valid contract: competent parties, so the capacity to contract; mutual consent, mutual assent, so mutuality, as well as genuine offer, genuine acceptance; Lawful objective, we forgot about that one. And 4, sufficient consideration. So remember, something of value does not need to be money, for instance. It can be a service, active forbearance. It's just something of value. And then for real estate contracts, it does need to be in writing, but not every contract needs to be in writing. But for real estate contracts, except leases of a year or less, those then all need to be in writing. The first one we have, which of the following is appurtenant to the land? A, library, B, water company stock, C, firehouse, D, house. Well, let's see here. We're looking what's appurtenant to the land. Well, we know there are 3 things that you should be thinking of when it comes to real property. The land itself, what's attached to the land or fixed, or appurtenant, which is what runs with the land. Well, looking at these ones, 3 of them are usually attached to the land. So the library, firehouse, and a house. Whereas water company stock just runs with the land. It's what you get when purchasing a land. You also get water company stock if it has water company stock, for instance. So the best answer is B, water company stock, because an appurtenance runs with the land and is considered real property. So what runs with the land? So remember, like an appurtenant easement, that runs with the land. Well, water company stock, if the property has water company stock, then that also runs with the land. 2, a deed must be signed by A, trustor, B, vendee, C, grantee, D, grantor. I'm going to give you a moment here. So when we're talking about deeds, well, you should be thinking between grantee or grantor, because trustor deals with the borrower. Vendee deals with land contracts, for instance, whereas grantee and grantor deals with deeds. Well, what's the difference between grantee and grantor? The best way I always like to do this is the grantor is the one that's actually conveying the property to someone, so like the seller, for instance, and grantee is the one that's receiving the property, so like the buyer. And a deed must be signed by the one conveying the property, so the grantor. So let's just kind of go over these terms real quick. Trustor, remember, it's just a borrower of a trust deed. Vendee is the buyer/borrower of a land contract. Grantee is the person receiving real property, and the grantor is the person conveying the real property. And the one conveying the real property is the one that must sign a deed. The grantee is one that's receiving real property. Of course, if anybody could just sign it and say, hey, I want your property, so I'm signing it, and it's valid, that would be absolutely chaotic. Whereas grantor is the one who actually owns the property and the one that can convey it. So they must sign the deed. 3, a seller carried back a note. If the buyer defaults due to job loss, what is seller's most likely action? A, quiet title action, B, foreclosure, C, specific performance, D, novation. Okay, well, the seller is carrying back a note. Well, what we're talking about here is that seller's actually doing a carryback loan, so it's doing the financing for the buyer. Well, if the buyer decides not to, or just defaults, doesn't necessarily decide, but can't afford to pay back the seller what the funds that were borrowed to him, for instance, well, what can the seller do? Well, the seller is basically acting as a lender. So what do we know on that account? Well, novation and specific performance have nothing to do with it. And so we'd be looking between quiet title action or foreclosure. Yes, quiet title action is usually to quiet the title, but for the lender to actually recoup his loss and receive title back to the property, foreclosure is his best bet. So B, foreclosure. 4, tenants give notice to a landlord that they intend to vacate the property. How long do they have to give notice? A, 21 days, B, 60 days, C, 30 days, D, 45 days. Okay, well, we're talking about the tenant giving notice, not the landlord. Because remember, when the landlord gives notice to the tenant, how long they have to
how long the notice has to be for depends on how long the tenant has been in the property. Whereas when the tenant gives notice, doesn't matter how long they've been in the property, they have to give at least 30 days notice. 30 days. 5. CC&R's deed, 5. CC&Rs deal with A, restrictions, B, financing, C, escrows, D, zoning. Well, what are CC&Rs? CC&Rs are covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Well, it's in the name, so we should be thinking restrictions is the best answer, but let's just break it through to make sure. Well, CC&Rs are an encumbrance, and an encumbrance limits title to the property, and CC&Rs limit it by use. So that is restricting them. It doesn't deal with financing, doesn't deal with escrow, and it doesn't deal with zoning. So the best answer is restrictions. The first question we have, 1. A lender would not be exempt from the requirement of providing the borrower with a federal right to rescind notice when the A, loan is for more than $25,000 and is not secured by the borrower's personal residence. B, security for the loan is commercial property. C, loan is for business expansion. D, borrower is refinancing his or her personal residence. Okay, so let's look at this question here. We're talking about that federal right to rescind notice. What do we know about that? That is when it deals with refinances on a personal residence, right? Okay, and you have that 3-day right to rescind if you refinance on your personal property, so your personal residence that you live in. Well, if we look at these answer options, well, A, it doesn't really matter for the amount, but it's not secured by the borrower's personal residence. That's not correct. B, security for the loan is commercial property. That's not a personal residence. No. C, loan is for business expansion. No. D, borrower is refinancing his or her personal residence. Yep, that is correct. And let's look into this a little bit more. So the 3-day right to rescission. So the truth in lending that we have, that provides for a borrower's right to cancel in regard to refinancing. So this isn't restructuring of a loan. This is refinancing, so new money is actually coming into the picture. So a lender must comply when a borrower is refinancing their personal residence or any time the borrower's residence is given as security for the refinanced loan. And a lender would be exempt, though, when a refinanced loan is for a business expansion, security for the refinanced loan is commercial property, or the refinanced loan is not secured by the borrower's personal residence. Okay? Question number 2. The instrument used to remove the lien of a trust deed from the record is called A, deed of reconveyance, B, certificate of redemption, C, satisfaction, D, release. Okay, so if you know stuff about mortgages, you might be thinking satisfaction, but we're talking about a deed of trust. So this is a lien. What is used when, for instance, the borrower, so the trustor, has paid off the debt and the trustee is then giving title back to the borrower, the trustor? They use an instrument called a deed of reconveyance. So this is needed when a loan is paid off, and this is when we're talking about a trust deed. 3, term impound means A, reserves, B, title insurance premium, C, homeowners association transfer fee, D, documentary transfer tax. So remember, when we look at the question, we need to figure out what they're asking here. Well, the first thing when we think of is just looking at what impound means. Well, what does impound come to you? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of that? Well, you should be thinking of, for instance, that additional money. So for instance, when you're paying a payment for your loan and you're paying your principal and interest, but they're also collecting taxes and insurance ahead of time. They do this so they're collecting reserves. So this is like a safety net to making sure that the borrower does pay taxes and insurance and they will not become a lien on the property. So remember, impounds are just reserves of property taxes and homeowners insurance. And remember, also, impounds are usually used when your LTV is over 80%. So they feel like this is a riskier loan, and they might not necessarily completely trust the borrower to be able to pay the property taxes and homeowners insurance in full and on time. So they collect it with the payments. 4, which of the following may make a secret profit on the purchase of real property? A, broker, B, salesperson, C, owner, D, all of the above are correct. So who may make a secret profit on the purchase of real property? Well, when we're talking about secret profits in California, anybody with a real estate license cannot make a secret profit. Well, real estate licenses that we have in California are broker and salespersons. So we, as licensees, cannot make a secret profit. But a real estate owner, they can make as many secret profits as they want. So owner is the correct answer. An owner may make a secret profit on the purchase of real property. Brokers and salespersons cannot make a secret profit. 5, a real estate broker dies in the middle of a transaction. What happens? A, all of the real estate broker's listings will automatically terminate. B, all of the real estate broker's listings will automatically move to the new broker who takes over the corporation. C, all of the real estate broker's listings will move to each of the salespeople in his office. D, none of the above are correct. Okay, so when we're talking about a real estate broker and the transactions that they have, so their listings, for instance, remember, them as a broker, they own the listing, not the salesperson that is under them. So we automatically know C is not correct. And you can't just automatically move a listing to a different broker. That's not allowed. That needs to be signed off on it. So B is not correct. A, all of the real estate broker's listings will automatically terminate. That's correct, because when the broker dies, then the broker is not a party to the transaction anymore, or party to the listing, and that will terminate. And then the new broker, though, that takes over will have to sign all new listing agreements in their name. So the correct answer is A. Well, I thank you for watching. I hope this was a helpful video. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact us at Accredited Real Estate Schools. We offer tons of exam preparation. And if you're wanting more questions to help prepare, we have a database of over 3,600 practice questions with explained answers. And they're also categorized into the 7 areas of the state exam, as well as ones that simulate the state test. So I do recommend checking us out. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us, but good luck with your licensing career, getting that real estate license.